First of all, thank you very much indeed for that crouching ovation. And thank you for the invitation to talk to you this evening. I've been given fairly strict instructions about how long I'm to speak for. The first time I ever spoke to a Rotary Club in my then constituency, I said to the president as we walked in, "How long do you want me to speak for?" And he said, you go on as long as you like, but we all leave at 2:15. So I'm aware of the fact that time is not indefinite. Let me just make a few remarks about an issue which is at present obsessing me, and then I'm very happy to take questions from the President or you about anything else, including the university. John Major tells a joke. Well, he tells more than one joke. But John Major tells a joke about, true story, about a meeting with Boris Yeltsin, when Boris Yeltsin was the president of Russia. And Yeltsin, as you probably know, had an issue about drink. They were having a bilateral meeting at number 10, and clearly for Yeltsin it was beginning too early in the morning. And John Major is sitting at the cabinet table in number 10 when Yeltsin arrives at 9 o'clock, 9:15. It's the Russian ambassador, looking slightly the worse for wear, grey with fatigue and hangover, and sits down opposite Major. And Major thinks he should start with a little light, bantering conversation. So he says to Yeltsin, he says, "Tell me, Mr. Yeltsin, what is the present state of the Russian economy?" And Yeltsin says, "Good." So Major says to him, "Would you like to say anything more about the Russian economy? What is the state of it?" And Yeltsin says, "Not good." And what I'd like to begin with is what I think is good, and then go on to say what I think is not good. The last book I wrote, I was saying this earlier, was called What Next? And I sent a copy to the Duke of Edinburgh, who was then the Chancellor of another new university in East Anglia. And he wrote back and said to me, "What next?" he said. When you're my age, there's only one answer. And I'm aware of the fact that I'm now at the grand old age of 73. I was born in 1944. And most of my life, my early life, was spent in a world that was divided ideologically. East and West, communism, capitalism, a Warsaw Pact versus Western Europe and America, and so on. Largely a consequence of the settlement after 50 years of appalling history in Europe, but also played out in the history of Asia, China and Japan in particular. There's a wonderful book by an Austrian Jewish intellectual called Stefan Zweig. He was quite a well-known poet, dramatist, translator, who fled Austria, fled Europe in the 1930s with the advance of fascism. But he wrote a book called The World of Yesterday, in which he described what European civilization was like at the beginning of the 20th century. The civilization of something which Winston Churchill called the noble continent. It's an extraordinarily evocative description of what life, self-confident life in that civilization was like. And then Zweig describes how it was shredded in the First World War, in the 1920s and 30s, first of all by xenophobic nationalism, by fascism, by communism, by class warfare. And Zweig wrote this book just after fleeing Europe and settling in Latin America, in Brazil. He wrote the book and sent it off to his publishers in 1942. And 3 days later, he and his wife committed suicide because he couldn't face what he believed was happening in Europe. Actually, there was worse to come in Europe because he wrote the book before the Wannsee Conference in 1942, which organized the industrial murder of 6 million Jews. But in the longer term, his pessimism wasn't entirely justified. 1945, Europe was a political, economic, moral rubble. You could say the same about much of Asia. And somehow we created world order out of that chaos. With extraordinary success, with, by and large, by the late 1980s, the sense that the argument for the relationship between economic and political freedom had been won. A great friend of mine who was Minister for Europe went as part of his ministerial duties to West Berlin, to the British section, in 1989. And the first day he's there, he's taken to see the wall and taken to see the canal which separated east from west. And the first afternoon he's there, a young East Berlin student is killed trying to get from the east to the west. And my friend says to his officials and says to the West Berlin authorities, I must make a protest about that, I must make a fuss, this is intolerable. And they said to him, I wouldn't do that, Minister. It might cause too much of a row. We have better ways of dealing with these issues. We'll talk to the East Berlin and East German authorities ourselves. Well, as William said, within a fortnight, there was no wall, no East Berlin, no East Germany, all swept into the ashcan of history. And it looked, then and subsequently, as though welfare democracy had won hands down. Well, Francis Fukuyama, the famous American political scientist, though I'm not sure there is such a thing as political science, but that's another matter. Francis Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History, in which he celebrated this triumph of democracy. This triumph for an international world order based very largely on welfare capitalism and international cooperation. That's the good bit. Well, we've seen what's happened since, with the growth of something which has come to obsess me, identity politics. The way in which people identify themselves very often with an extraordinarily narrow view of where they come from or what they believe. You get identity politics defined in terms of ethnicity, or origin, or race, or national boundaries. In the case of those white supremacists who we saw demonstrating in Charlottesville a few months ago, carrying those signs saying blood and soil, you get the sort of nationalism which produced the first 50 years of the last century in Europe. And I guess the first example of that sort of identity politics was 9/11 and the assault by largely Saudi, largely middle class, largely educated jihadi terrorists using credit cards on the Twin Towers in New York. As though jihadi terrorism had anything to do with the Quran. Any more than the Ku Klux Klan have anything to do with Christianity. Or the British National Front with British values. I'd been interested in this subject of identity politics for years. For one simple reason, that I didn't believe that what some people say is the first question in politics, who are we, what is the nature of community, was answerable in those terms of narrow identity, in terms which encouraged what a very great French, Lebanese, Christian, Arab writer, Armin Malouf, calls the panthers of identity politics. Because I looked at myself, I looked at my own identity, and that was so complicated. And I've always thought that community was actually a collection of I's, because everybody else is as complicated as I am. Lower middle class, I'm called a Tory grandee. I can tell you I'm the only grandee who ever came from Greenford in Middlesex. Rather dreary housing on the arterial roads out of London. Irish, potato famine Irish. My great-grandfather was born in a little town in Roscommon where the population today is lower than it was in 1829 when he was born. Repaired chairs when he fled Ireland. Worked in cotton mills. My grandfather, the only one of the family who was properly educated, became a head teacher. Partly because of all that, I was brought up as a Catholic, and I'm still a rather argumentative Catholic today. So a complicated identity, of which I was made more aware when I was an undergraduate at Oxford. Not because Balliol made me, but because the people who taught me had a huge impact on me. An issue which caused considerable interest among MI5 when I was being positively vetted for the Cabinet and the Cabinet Secretariat was that my moral tutor at Balliol was a Marxist, atheist, member of the Communist Party, who had written an encomium to Joe Stalin when Stalin died. So what did I take from that? I took, and I could have said the same about a couple of my other tutors, I took the notion, the understanding, that life was about more than my own prejudices and opinions. And I took from that there is a huge difference between having an argument with people and having a quarrel with them. One of the reasons why I find the idea of safe spaces at universities or no platforming so fundamentally offensive. I mean, nothing to do with what life at a university should be like. Universities should be regarded as pillars of liberalism, of liberal values, of free speech. So, complicated, not easily fitted into a normal box. Somebody who became, after quite a lot of thought, old-fashioned left-wing Tory. My hero was somebody called Rab Butler, who many of you will not have heard of. Somebody who was a wonderful personal celebration of the whole notion of ambivalence, which I think is an underrated political virtue. He was also capable of some malicious ambiguity. I was once at a dinner for somebody who'd been his private secretary for years, and Rab, who was then the master of Trinity College, Cambridge, was supposed to be the guest of honour. And at the last moment, he sent a telegram apologising for not being able to be there, saying, terribly sorry I can't be with you. There is no one whose farewell dinner I would rather have attended. So the ambivalence slipping into malicious ambiguity from time to time. When I went into the House of Commons and when I became a minister, I found myself, and then governor of Hong Kong, I found myself dealing again and again with issues of identity politics. I was a minister in Northern Ireland. I reorganised the police service in Northern Ireland to encourage more Catholics to join it, to stop it being the police service being the target of political violence. And the idea that Northern Ireland was a struggle between people who felt passionately about Luther's 95 Theses and people who felt passionately about transubstantiation or papal infallibility. I mean, for the Byrds, it was about power. It was about who had the swagger. It was about who was the top dog. I found myself dealing with not just the alleged politics of religion. I found myself dealing with the alleged politics of ethnicity in the Balkans when I was a European commissioner, where with the dismemberment of Yugoslavia, the Serbs didn't want the Croats to run Croatia, and the Croatians didn't want the Serbs to run what was left of Yugoslavia. Ethnically, they were all Slavs. They spoke the same language. Those very tall guys at Wimbledon with names ending in IC, they're all Slavs. It was about power once again. And then in Hong Kong, finding myself criticized for rather limited attempts to extend suffrage in Hong Kong and to stand up for the rule of law and the protection of civil liberties and human rights. I found myself criticized by Lee Kuan Yew and others for not understanding that there was a civilizational difference between Asia and Europe and America, that human rights weren't universal. All I have to say parenthetically, an attempt to justify the soft authoritarianism of Singapore, but the idea that it doesn't feel the same if you're tortured in Asia as it does if you're in Guantanamo. The idea that freedom of speech isn't important in preventing corruption in Asia just as it is in Europe and America. Always struck me as being for the Byrds, and you looked across Asia and you saw all sorts of different political structures, from democracy in India and Japan to Stone Age totalitarianism in North Korea. So that idea of identity politics is one that I became increasingly obsessed with. And that obsession grew with the growth as well of xenophobic nationalism in Europe, with Marine Le Pen, with the AfD in Germany, and not just in Europe with Make America Great Again and President Trump, but also here with our relationship with Europe. Now, I don't want to find myself in trouble with Mr. Heaton Harris or the government whip's office for giving you a strong lecture about my views on Brexit, which are quite well known. I am what the Daily Mail would call an enemy of the people. But just let me say this. Nationalism is different from patriotism. Nationalism doesn't feel obliged to glamorize our institutions, to snowflake bits of our history that we don't much care for. Nationalism doesn't need the other to define it. I'll give us an illustration. In 1961, a very clever right-wing, Cambridge-educated, classical scholarship politician, Enoch Powell, gave a speech about English nationalism, which was full of wonderful sounding but slightly balmy stuff about English country churches and hedgerows and herbaceous borders and all that malarkey. And he finished up by quoting from Herodotus. And he talked about the Athenians coming back to Athens after the Persians had burnt Athens to the ground. And they come back to this heap of anthracite. And in the middle of it, they see one olive tree, still alive, shooting out green branches. And Enoch says at the end of this speech, so I imagine one day coming back to England, which was being, in his view, undermined by immigration, coming back to England and seeing the English oak still growing, still throwing out green shoots. Made the speech, nobody took a blind bit of notice. 6 years later, he made another speech in Wolverhampton, in which he referred to another classical text, He referred to Virgil, Book 6, the Aeneid. He talks about the river Tiber foaming with much blood, and talks about grinning pickaninnies, and talks about people having excreta pushed through their letterboxes. And my God, people notice that. Car workers marching in the West Midlands, dockers marching in the East End. And in my view, it is invariably the case that nationalism finds its most potent definition in finding a group within its own society or outside that it can summon hate for. During the Brexit campaign, there were, according to the research which has been done by social scientists and others, there were 99 cases during the campaign when anti-immigrant stories appeared on the front page of our tabloids. 30 cases in the Daily Mail. This drip, drip, drip of anti-immigrant sentiment. Now, let's say one other thing about Brexit, which is, I think it's the most important political issue of my life within British and European politics. People say to me, where's it going to end? And I say, well, I have no idea. I'm in very good company because neither does the government. But it all reminds me, or the people who started us down this road, it all reminds me of one of the best speeches I heard in the House of Commons in the early 1980s, delivered by a wonderful left-wing politician called Michael Foot. People who compare Jeremy Corbyn with Michael Foot don't know what they're talking about. I mean, it's like comparing Ed Balls in Strictly Come Dancing with Baryshnikov. I mean, this is not a reasonable comparison to make at all. Michael Foot was a wonderful orator, very clever man, great essayist. And he was making a speech just after Keith Joseph, All Souls. Keith Joseph who was the sort of intellectual power behind, well, not power, the intellectual influence on Margaret Thatcher. And Keith was business secretary, and he'd just been up to the North and Midlands, where British industry was being devastated by the then economic policy, which squeezed British manufacturing between a very tough monetary policy and an increasingly high exchange rate because of North Sea oil. So Keith Joseph is going around these factories looking increasingly worried and desperate and forlorn as he sees one closed factory after another. Pictures of him in the papers looking miserable. So in the debate the following week in Parliament, Michael Foot says this had all reminded him, seeing Keith Joseph, of his favourite comedian when he was MP in Plymouth and used to go to the local music hall every Saturday night. And the main comedian there used to pretend to be a magician. And at the beginning of his act every night, he would go down to the front row and he would ask if he could borrow somebody's watch. And he'd take what looked to be a gold watch from a very aldermanic looking figure. He'd take it up onto the stage and put it on the table in front of him, cover it with a cloth, pick up a great hammer and bring it smashing down on the watch. He'd say abracadabra. He'd then pick up the cloth, look slightly anxious, repeat the whole process, pick up the cloth again, and then be seen to be sweeping shards of glass and bits of the mechanics of the watch into his hand. He'd carry it very carefully down to the front of the stage and give it back to the alderman, saying, "I'm very sorry," he'd say, "but I've forgotten the rest of the trick." That, I think, is the position that Mr. Johnson and Mr. Gove and some of the others in at the moment. They've forgotten the rest of the trick. Where are we going to land? There was a marching song, British Army marching song, in the Second World War. It arguably goes back even before that, which went like this. We won't know where we're going till we're there. Repeated several times, which is, I guess, become one of the mottos of the Brexiteers these days, along with the old Millwall football supporters song, "No one likes us, we don't care," which is our sort of international anthem now. So I still think there's quite a lot to fight for, and I'm just, I don't want to sound sanctimonious, well, not too sanctimonious, but I'm just ashamed really that my generation, who had an extraordinarily fortunate 50 or 60 years, is passing on this legacy to your generation, and I hope it doesn't end as badly as I fear it may. Maybe we can stop it, but whatever happens, I hope you'll manage to build something out of this wreckage.
So thank you, firstly, for joining us again, Lord Patten. It's fantastic that you managed to make time to come here. I wanted to start by asking your thoughts on the last few days with the allegations that have come up, both on the Labour and Tory side, and yesterday leading to Michael Fallon's resignation. What you think Parliament can do to sort of combat some of these allegations that are coming through, whether you think it was right for Michael Fallon to have resigned, given the journalist herself said it's ridiculous that if he was resigning because of what happened to her. I wanted to ask for your comment on that to start.
Well, let me talk about, I don't want to talk particularly about Michael Fallon. His son was, I think, here, may still be here, and so I certainly don't want to. But let me talk about the general issue. I think much has changed for the better in my lifetime. I think we've become not only a healthier society, you're all going to live longer by about 15 or 20 years than I will. A more decent society, more relaxed about racial issues. I've got 8 grandchildren, 3 of them are mixed race, and nobody seems to give a toss about that these days. I think on balance, we are much better about gender issues and about issues of sexual preference. I look back, some of you will have seen that terrific film about Alan Turing, the Imitation Game. I'm enthusiastic about it myself because my son-in-law was in it. Here is one of the greatest heroes of the Second World War. The man who, more than anyone else, cracked the Enigma code, regarded as a huge hero, never praised for it. Goes off to be professor of economics or maths at Manchester University after the war. A few years after that, is found by the police in his own home, having a homosexual relationship with another man, consensual, goes to court, is sentenced to be chemically castrated, and shortly after that, commits suicide. And nobody in the establishment, though they knew perfectly well what a hero had been, nobody in the establishment lifted a finger to help him. It is literally inconceivable that that could happen today. So we live in a better world. But there is still, I think, too little respect for other people's sexuality, for other people's integrity, for other people's bodies. And it's particularly something which women have to suffer, because partly of testosterone, partly because there are a lot of men who don't understand that white wine is alcoholic, who, given a few drinks, start to grope. politicians of whom you couldn't actually refer to as being a safe pair of hands, because they were clearly very unsafe pairs of hands. And I think exposing that, while of course some of the cases being talked about don't seem to me to fall into that category at all. If two adults have a consensual relationship, that should have no interest for the Daily Mail or the tabloids or the public. But if a politician who's doubtless appeared in an election manifesto, election address, with a happy face, with a happy family, appearing to exemplify family values, if he's then found to be groping his personal assistant or secretary, I think that's intolerable. And I think that it's shameful what's come out about Westminster, but we shouldn't think that it's just Westminster where this happens. It happens in any large organisation still. Women are treated too much like sex objects. This is the same son-in-law I was talking about just now. I went for the second time, because my son-in-law's in it, to see a remarkable play by James Graham in London called Ink, which is about Rupert Murdoch's takeover of the Sun. And it ends with the first Sun page 3 girl. It ends with her feeling having agreed to be photographed in order to encourage men up and down the country to masturbate. It finishes with her realizing how shameful this has been for her and her family. I bumped into Claire Short coming out of the theatre, who used to campaign with Diane Abbott and one or two others against page 3 girls. And they used to be laughed at for doing something which most of us now would think was simply a statement of civility. So I think that it's about time that not just Westminster but others cleaned up their act as well. I've got 3 daughters. I think, like a lot of women in this room, they've all had some experience of this sort of thing, sometimes perhaps meant in fun, but not meant in fun unless you kick somebody in the testicles. So I think it's pretty shameful, and except that I don't like it turning into a witch hunt about anybody who's had any sort of sexual relationship that we disapprove of, I do think that it's time we cleaned all this up rather than covered it up. Whether it's, particularly if it's rape, but even if it's sort of drunken groping, it's not acceptable. So I hope that doesn't sound too much like a parish priest.
Great, thank you. I'm conscious not to take up too much time, so I'm just going to touch lastly before I open up to the audience on your role as Chancellor and links to that. And something you mentioned in your opening remarks was just the importance of freedom of speech and your support for that. So my question is this: do you think the right to freedom of speech includes the right of academic staff to express politically incorrect views? And if so, to what extent?
Well, I'm just wondering if my Marxist moral tutor would have been regarded as politically incorrect. When he died, an academic at another university claimed that he must have been an agent of influence because he was a communist who worked in the Foreign Office during the war. Hadn't had the balls, hadn't had the guts to make the claim when Christopher Hill was alive. And I think there's always a danger of being a little precious about this. I think that provided what people say is within the law and isn't an incitement to hatred and provided there are in place proper arrangements to which people can turn if they think that they are being having their own views assaulted too aggressively, I think that any university should welcome freedom of speech. And if a university starts to censor free speech, then I think it's denying one of the most important roles of a university in a free society. If you don't have free speech in a university, where do you have it? If people who try to speak their mind are subjected to fascistic behavior, whether of the left or the right, I think that's intolerable. So you encourage me to say one or two other things. I was in Hong Kong 3 or 4 weeks ago, talking to young men and women who face going to prison because they argue for free speech. And then I come back to Britain and I find that there are people who want universities to be full of safe spaces where you can't speak your mind. Now let me take a specific example. I'm in favour of gay marriage. I've voted for every liberalisation of homosexual legislation that was put before Parliament when I was a member. If I didn't believe in gay marriage and wanted to make a speech about it, would that entitle people to shout me down? It would certainly entitle people to have an argument with me, but I think it would be intolerable if I couldn't express my views. What if I had a different view on abortion? I'm actually a Catholic. If you listen to Jacob Rees-Mogg, who gets Catholic teaching on abortion wrong, because it's actually much tougher than he suggested, but I don't agree with him, neither do most Catholics when you look at opinion surveys of what Catholics think. But if I had a view, a very strong pro-life view on abortion, would that entitle undergraduates at St. John's College to shout me down and not to let me make a speech and not to let me express my views? I think once a university drifts in that direction, forget about it. Then you can start to believe that universities are just places where you go in order to make more money afterwards. But that's not what a university should be about. And I think it's worrying that to people who have, I imagine, high IQs, one has to make this point. So I feel as strongly about this issue, not least because what I see people suffering for, people your age in Hong Kong, I feel more strongly about this issue than almost any other at the moment. And I just wish that there were more members of the student body who would stand up and say this, and just not leave it to old farts like me. I really think it's an important issue, because I do think in the next few years we're all too likely to be faced by a drift towards populist authoritarianism. And I think that liberalism, free speech, is the most important way of stopping that. And one moment you're shouting at people because you don't like their views on abortion, or because you don't like their views on contraception, or because you don't like their views on gay marriage, or because you don't like them because they once went out with Jacob Rees-Mogg. The next moment, you're shouting people down on even more important grounds than those. So I think we have to watch it.
Thank you for that. We're now going to open up to the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand nice and high and wait until the microphone gets to you. Yeah, let's start with you in the purple.
Thank you so much for a fascinating speech. So what do you think is the future of the British political system? Thank you.
The British public school?
No. So what do you think is the future of the British political parties?
Oh, I see.
Thank you.
That's not necessarily, if you look at the recent Tory leadership, different from the future of British public schools. I just said I'm going to make a speech next term about the purpose of a university, if I can digress for a moment. but which one of the things I want to take on and criticize is our tendency, I think, at this university to produce plausible bullshitters. And I think we should really think rather more about the purpose of education and the relationship between a university and the improvement of society. What do I think of the future of British political parties? Well, first of all, even with momentum and the increase in membership of the Labour Party, I think I'm right in saying that there's a smaller proportion of the electorate who are members of political parties in this country than almost any other European country. The membership of the party I know best, of which I used to be chairman, when there were, I think, 500,000 members, that membership is now said to be less than 100,000. You could get the active members of the Conservative Party into Wembley Stadium. A lot of them would have difficulty with the steps, but you could nevertheless, fit them all in. And the average age of active members of the Conservative Party, if you believe the Bow Group, it's 72. I don't believe the Bow Group. I think it's about 60. But nevertheless, it's not clearly greatly appealing to people of your age. And I think that's a worry if you're a Conservative. If you're a Conservative, you should be bloody worried that Mr. Corbyn has a plurality among everybody below the age of 45. You should be quite worried that when you looked at voting intentions by newspaper readership at the last election, you discovered that the Conservative Party had a lead over Labour among Financial Times readers of 1%. Should be a concern if you're a Conservative. On the Labour side, I think it's a worry that, and it's a worry for some of my moderate friends in the Labour Party, and as you know, in politics, your opponents are in other parties, your enemies are in your own. I think it's a worry for some of my friends in the Labour Party that the people who they think have taken over the Labour Party are the people who in the 1970s and 80s were trying to get rid of them, were trying to drive them out of politics. One or two of whom, and I don't say it in any exaggeration, are old-fashioned Stalinists, not just trots. So I think there are problems on both sides, and I think they're partly related to the fact that the political parties aren't seen by much of the electorate as representing something which is authentic and relates to the narrative of their own lives. And I don't think in that respect that the outlook is a particularly encouraging one. And maybe that is all related as well to the fact that individual living standards in this country have been in such precipitous decline for so long. The amount of money people have left over at the end of the week, not me, but increasingly large number of people. Social equity is a real issue in this country, and it shouldn't be. The answer to social inequity isn't, in my view, to nationalize everything that moves, and even some things that don't move. But there's a real issue there. There's a real issue in the fact that, much more important than Brexit actually, that we have such an appallingly low productivity economy and therefore low wages as well. Those are the big issues that we should be tackling, not whether or not we like Mr. Juncker. I don't actually, but that's not terribly relevant.
Great, thank you for that, and thank you for the question. Yeah, let's go to you on the end there, and then.
Hello, thank you very much for coming. A few years ago, there were pictures circulated in the UK press of yourself on a visit to Hong Kong, and what we saw was Hong Kong protesters waving flags, the British colonial flag of Hong Kong, and attempting to heckle you in your car and show appreciation for you. This sort of clashes with a lot of discussion that we have here about the empire and so on. How should we, given your unique insights, interpret those sentiments in Hong Kong at the moment? Thank you.
Well, first of all, can I just say that we shouldn't glamorize or try to defend imperialism now. Nor would we seek, I'm sure, to do so. What happened in China and Hong Kong in the 19th century would be unimaginable, or should be unimaginable today, unless I suppose you look at Russia's behavior in the Crimea. But Hong Kong was acquired by defeating the Chinese, first of all, in a war which was all about trying to globalize the Chinese economy by flogging opium to them in order to keep the Indian balance of payments on side. And then the rest of Hong Kong, the largest part of Hong Kong, the new territories, the biggest part of the new territories, was acquired oversight on a 99-year lease, which is why the whole question of Hong Kong's impermanence and return to China came about. I think that Hong Kong and the return to China posed big problems both for the Chinese and for the British. Problems that were both political and moral. And they were brilliantly submerged in Deng Xiaoping's one country, two systems mantra. For the Chinese, Hong Kong represented some of the humiliations of Qing history. It also represented a humiliation in a different way, because more than half the population of Hong Kong, were refugees from events which had been taking place in Mao's mainland China. And people from mainland China, fleeing the Cultural Revolution or the Great Leap Forward or the Great Famine, had clambered over razor wire, had swum through dangerous seas in order to get to this colonial bastion. How could it be, you must have asked yourself if you were a member of the Communist Party in Beijing. Why do they want to go and live in this colonial outpost? For the British, it was difficult in another way. First of all, because we weren't very proud of how we'd acquired Hong Kong in the first place. Secondly, because there was a real moral problem for us. When I was leaving Hong Kong, one of my last visits was to a hospital for the mentally ill. And I was walking down a passage between the wards, and a very formally dressed Chinese chap rattling on the bars around his ward says, "Governor, can I have a word with you?" And to the horror of my bodyguard, I walked across to talk to him. And he said to me, "Could you just answer a couple of questions for me, Governor?" He said, "Tell me," he said, "you would regard Britain as one of the oldest democracies in the world, wouldn't you?" I said, "Yes." So he said, "You presumably regard China as the last great Leninist communist society." And I said, "Well, I wouldn't put it quite like that, but yes, I see what you mean." So he said, "Well, could you tell me why it is, given your views on democracy, that you're handing Hong Kong back to China without consulting the people of Hong Kong about what they want?" And it was a very fair question. And the answer was, we had no choice. So there was a moral problem for us in not preparing Hong Kong to be a democratic, independent country. In the 1970s, Zhou Enlai and other Chinese leaders made clear to Britain that they didn't want democracy to be developed in Hong Kong because they thought that it would give people in Hong Kong the impression that sooner or later they were going to be Singapore or another independent country. Come 1997, we'd agreed, we had rows about the development of democracy, but the Chinese had promised that the rather limited democratic changes we'd made would be in the hands of the people of Hong Kong after 1997. They would determine what sort of legislative arrangements they had. We'd put in place defences of the rule of law, of civil liberties. We hadn't used any of those old colonial ordinances on public order which had been put in place during the Cultural Revolution riots and so on. And we'd stood up for Hong Kong's autonomy. And for the first years after 1997, I think things went pretty well. I think, as I was saying upstairs, they've gone less well recently for a number of reasons. First of all, because of the relationship between the crackdown on dissidents in China and the growth of authoritarianism in China, going back on what was happening under Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, and democracy in Hong Kong. Secondly, because I think the Chinese government thinks that it doesn't need Hong Kong anymore, because in '97 Hong Kong represented 17% of China's economy. Now it only represents 3%. They also think that they're sufficiently important in the world to tell the rest of the world to get stuffed when it says, but you're breaking your word to Hong Kong, you're in breach of a treaty. So I'm a bit nervous about the way forward. I hope that we can make clear to China, the international community, that if China breaks its word on Hong Kong, what will we be able to believe China about? And I also hope that people in Hong Kong won't give up hope or faith. At the moment, what's encouraging are, and I don't just say it to flatter you, what's most encouraging is the view of young people in Hong Kong, who are robustly in favour of the continuing development of democracy, who continue to argue passionately for the rule of law, for independent courts. I've told them that I think it's a huge mistake for them to allow the campaign for democracy to morph into a campaign for independence, which isn't going to happen, which dilutes support for democracy and which plays into the hands of the hardliners in the Communist Party in Beijing. But by and large, people like Joshua Wong are real heroes, and we'll be reading about them in 50 years' time.
Great, thank you for that. And thank you for the question. We have time for one more. Yeah, let's go to you.
Thank you for once again being so inspiring. My question is about shouting fire in crowded theatres, because we all respect the primacy and importance of free speech, but I think one has to agree that there are boundaries, and particularly in the light of the events of the last week, I'm always inclined to feel that the boundaries are somewhere in the vicinity of the Daily Mail.
A bit of what?
The boundaries to free speech and what it is acceptable to say, and at what point free speech or the exercise of free speech wanders into the realm of provocation and incitement to hatred. I'd just like to get your views about, in particular with reference to what we hear in the Daily Mail and other similar publications. What we do and what, sorry? I'd like your view on whether free speech should end at provocation to hatred, as we see in Daily Mail, for example.
No, I mean, I said, I think earlier, that I believe in free speech within the rule of law. And there's legislation against hate speech. There's legislation against provocation to violence. But I think wherever you limit free speech, you have to be extremely careful. There's, of course, as the great and wonderfully British, Irish, Edmund Burke said, liberty must be limited in order to be possessed. So of course everybody knows the difference between license and freedom. And everybody knows that free speech, or what is regarded as free speech, can go too far. I think that sometimes the way the American Constitution is interpreted goes much further than, not necessarily in relation to speech, but in relation to other things, where actually freedom of speech is taken to cover things like donations to political parties, which is, I think, crazy. But I think you have to be very, very careful when you start intervening and stopping people speaking their minds, unless they're willfully trying to hurt other people. And if a university isn't about the exchange of views robustly within the law, then I don't know the purpose. Then it should just be regarded as somewhere that people are trained to get more money for working for Goldman Sachs. I think that would be a great pity. I think that when the chairman of the House of Commons Education Committee says the whole purpose, he said, the whole purpose of university education is to give people the skills and the intellectual resources so they can earn more money. I think when the chairman of the House of Commons Education Committee makes a remark like that, one should respond with the argument for the values which are represented by higher education. But one of those values is speaking freely, which is at the root of inquiry, of scholarship, of pushing back the frontiers of knowledge. In China at the moment, free speech would exist in a university, does exist in universities, where you're arguing about, when you're talking about science, when you're trying to push back the frontiers in the life sciences or physics or electronics or whatever. It doesn't actually exist when you're trying to tell a joke. So if you send somebody on the internet a picture of Winnie the Pooh, you're thought to be making fun of the President of China. Free speech? So you'll always find me on the side of freedom of speech, even when people are rubbishing me, and I've been called everything in my time, from minister of treachery to enemy of the people to a tango dancer to a sinner condemned for 1,000 years to a whore who opened his legs for President Clinton. That was a new one. And suggested aspects of my anatomy which I wasn't aware of. But anyway, I've been called pretty well everything, and I think that it hasn't harmed me, and I think I was hugely helped by the education I received here. I mentioned Christopher Hill. Two other, just let me refer briefly to the two other people here who most influenced me. One was a great medieval scholar called Maurice Keene, who wrote the best book on chivalry. And he taught me about the importance of avoiding what Ernie Bevan used to call klitsch, or generalizations. My very first essay, I was reading on Charlemagne. Maurice had a stammer, used to smoke wretched little black cheroots, and he'd wander around the room while you were talking. So he said to me, Mr. Patton, could you start your essay, please? And I began, Charlemagne can truly be called the founder of modern Europe. And I heard Maurice Keene behind me saying, I beg your pardon, which taught me a bit or two about generalization. And Maurice and Richard Cobb, who, when sober, was a wonderful scholar, and who had one of his obsessions was with a case involving a French peasant poisoner called the Good Lady of Loudun, who had had several husbands and lovers, all of whom died in mysterious circumstances, usually with large amounts of arsenic in their bodies, always leaving her large amounts of money. And the police, who weren't entirely stupid, thought there was some relationship between the deaths and the money. They spent 10 years trying to convict this woman. And they fell at the last fence because the prosecutors had jumbled up bits of the bodies. And there was one bit in particular which used to greatly interest Richard Cobb, and was, I think, the source of his refusal to accept that you could package people. I think it was the source of his passionate view that you had to let people argue what they wanted. There was this one eye of one of the bodies which was put into the wrong bottle. And I always thought this eye was really important to Richard, this eye which always reminded him of the complications of identity, and always reminded him of the fact that you had to look at identity and look at differences in as open-minded a way as possible. So Freedom of speech is something I'd go to the stake for. I hope not literally, because people did go to the stake for it here in Oxford a few hundred years ago.
Great. Thank you for that question. Please join me in thanking Lord Patten.